Babylon, a name that echoes across thousands of years, shrouded in both wonder and dread. Imagine a city where the walls were so vast that chariots thundered along their tops, where massive ziggurats climbed toward the heavens, and where kings spoke with the authority of gods. To the outside world, Babylon gleamed with power, wealth, and glory. But beneath its splendor, the city pulsed with something far more sinister. It was a place built on fear, held together by cruelty, and obsessed with death. Laws were written not in ink, but in blood. Kings demanded worship not as men, but as divine beings whose word was law, and whose punishments were savage. Babylon wasn't merely the cradle of civilization. It was a cradle of terror, a place where grandeur masked brutality, and where the people lived each day under the shadow of both their rulers and their gods. Babylon didn't begin as an empire. It started as a modest city-state nestled along the banks of the Euphrates River, a place of simple beginnings, where life was defined by the rhythms of agriculture and trade. The rise of Babylon began with the rise of one man, Hammurabi. In the 18th century BC, Hammurabi ascended the throne, and with ruthless ambition, he would transform this modest city into the center of one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world. His reign marked a shift from the old ways of tribal rule and regional alliances to an empire built on law, order, and brutality. Hammurabi's most famous legacy was his Code of Laws, a set of 282 rules carved into stone for all to see. But these weren't laws born of fairness. They were born of fear. The code was a tool to control the masses, a reminder of the ruthless power Hammurabi wielded over his subjects. Each law came with a chilling punishment, a reminder that disobedience would be met with swift and often brutal retribution. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and far worse for anyone who dared to step out of line. The punishments were public, meant to serve not just as justice, but as a warning. The codes themselves were not just written to ensure fairness. They were carved in stone to embed fear deep into the hearts of the people. A woman accused of adultery could be drowned. A slave who struck his master would be executed. And any crime against the state, whether it be lying to a judge or failing to uphold Hammurabi's decrees, was met with punishment that might be too horrific to describe. These laws ensured that no one, no matter how high or low in society, would dare defy the will of Babylon's king. Hammurabi's reign was one where cruelty and fear maintained the status quo, and in doing so, he cemented Babylon's supremacy over Mesopotamia. Under Hammurabi, Babylon was not just an empire. It was a city where law and terror were indistinguishable, where kings ruled not only with authority, but with the unyielding threat of death. The Code of Hammurabi was not just a set of laws. It was a manual for maintaining absolute control through fear. Inscribed on a towering stone stele and placed in public view, the code stood as a brutal reminder of the king's iron-fisted rule. The laws were clear, unyielding, and terrifying. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, was more than a phrase. It was the bedrock of Hammurabi's justice. But this was no simple retribution. It was a meticulously crafted system designed to terrorize and enforce obedience. A son who struck his father could face the loss of his hand. A builder whose house collapsed, killing its occupants, was to be executed. Disobedience to authority, whether from a slave, a free man, or even a noble, was punishable by mutilation or death. These laws weren't about fairness or justice in the modern sense. They were about maintaining the brutal hierarchy of Babylonian society. Fear was the foundation upon which the empire rested, and the laws were designed to make sure that fear never waned. Perhaps the most chilling law was that for adultery. A woman caught in the act was drowned, her life extinguished for violating the most sacred of familial bonds. The husband of the woman could decide her fate, and if he did not bring her to justice, the law would do so. But men were given far more leniency. If a man was caught with a married woman, He could simply pay a fine, as long as the wife was not of a noble family. In this, Hammurabi's code was clear: men had power over women, and their punishment was far less severe. The law served as a tool to maintain societal order, with women's bodies controlled by the dictates of the state. Hammurabi's laws were less a system of justice and more a system of terror. Each law was a sharp reminder that disobedience or transgression would result in a public, humiliating, and often fatal consequence. Punishments weren't just designed to restore order. They were designed to intimidate. People didn't just fear breaking the law. They feared the brutal methods of enforcement, knowing that their lives could be shattered with the stroke of a ruler's decree. The fear these laws instilled went beyond mere obedience. It was about survival. Under Hammurabi's reign, the code wasn't a tool for justice in the traditional sense. It was a reminder of how easily life could be taken, how quickly an empire could crush its own people under the weight of its laws. The message was clear: break the law, and your very humanity would be torn apart. In Babylon, kings weren't just rulers, they were gods on earth, wielding absolute power that transcended mere governance. Hammurabi, like his successors, didn't rule as a man, but as a divine figure, the embodiment of the gods' will. The people of Babylon were not simply subjects, they were devotees, forced to worship their king, as one would worship the divine pantheon that controlled their fate. Disobeying the king wasn't just treason, it was an affront to the gods themselves, a sin punishable by death. The king's divine status was enshrined in every aspect of Babylonian society. Religious rituals weren't just sacred, they were the tools of governance, designed to maintain the illusion that the king was anointed by the gods, chosen to rule with their authority. The Babylonians believed that their king's power was a direct reflection of divine will. When the king spoke, it wasn't just the voice of a man. It was the voice of Marduk or Ishtar, deities whose will governed the cosmos. The king was seen as the mediator between gods and men, and the welfare of the entire empire rested on his ability to fulfill his divine role. To maintain this divine aura, the king regularly engaged in grand religious ceremonies. Sacrifices were offered to the gods to ensure that the king's reign continued to be blessed, and that Babylon would prosper. These sacrifices weren't just symbolic acts, they were brutal displays of power. Animals, and occasionally humans, were slaughtered in elaborate rituals meant to appease the gods. The blood spilt in these ceremonies was seen as a divine offering, ensuring that the king's rule would remain unchallenged. But the rituals went beyond mere sacrifice. The king's every move was steeped in symbolism, his actions interpreted as signs from the gods themselves. Omens were eagerly sought and feverishly analyzed. Priests, reading the entrails of sacrificed animals, or studying the flight patterns of birds, would interpret these signs, offering guidance on how the king should proceed. Every decision, every conquest, and every act of governance was seen as a fulfillment of the gods' will, reinforcing the idea that Babylon was not just ruled by a king, but by the will of the divine. In this environment, fear was intertwined with reverence. The people didn't just fear their king because of his political power. They feared him because of the divine wrath that could be unleashed upon them if they disobeyed. To challenge the king was to challenge the gods themselves, and no one could survive such blasphemy. The king's ability to control not just the laws of men, but the very fate of his people through divine mandate, created an unshakable fear. Babylonian society was held together not only by law, but by the oppressive weight of religious awe and fear. A system where disobedience could result in divine punishment, both on earth and in the afterlife. The king's divine nature was thus both a shield and a sword, protecting his reign while allowing him to rule with unparalleled authority. The people of Babylon lived in awe of their king, knowing that to question him was question the gods themselves. And in this divine hierarchy, the king's word was law, absolute, unchallenged, and sacred. Nebuchadnezzar II stands as one of the most infamous rulers in Babylonian history. His name synonymous with both awe-inspiring architectural grandeur and unspeakable brutality. He ruled Babylon at its height, transforming it into one of the most powerful and opulent empires the world had ever seen. Yet beneath the splendor of his architectural feats lay a tyrant whose reign was marked by cruelty, conquest, and fear. One of Nebuchadnezzar's most enduring legacies is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Often considered one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, these lush, terraced gardens, built in the heart of the desert, symbolized Nebuchadnezzar's vision of power and prestige. His reign was a time of extraordinary building projects, where the city's walls were strengthened to a staggering size, and monumental palaces rose like fortresses. The Ishtar Gate, adorned with lions and dragons, stood as a testament to Babylon's might, and the Great Ziggurat, a temple tower reaching to the heavens, loomed over the city. These architectural marvels were not just for the enjoyment of the people, but to cement Nebuchadnezzar's status as a divine ruler, as though he were building a city fit for the gods themselves. Yet, while his hands crafted wonders, his heart bore the marks of a brutal conqueror. Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns were marked by relentless conquest and terror. His most infamous military action was the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. The city home to the Israelites was razed to the ground, and its inhabitants were exiled to Babylon in what became known as the Babylonian captivity. The destruction of the first temple and the mass deportations were not mere acts of war. They were designed to break the spirit of the Jews, to extinguish their faith, and to ensure their absolute subjugation. Nebuchadnezzar crushed any remnants of rebellion with a ruthless hand, leaving the people of Jerusalem and the surrounding regions in ruins. The contrast between Nebuchadnezzar's architectural achievements and his reign of terror couldn't be starker. On one hand, he created lasting symbols of Babylon's might and splendor, emblems of a civilization that seemed to touch the divine. On the other, his cruelty toward conquered peoples, particularly his treatment of the Israelites, showed the darker side of his empire. His construction projects were a facade of civilization, masking the bloodshed and violence that allowed such opulence to flourish. To the people of the cities he conquered, Nebuchadnezzar's name was synonymous with suffering and loss. He imposed his rule not through benevolence but through fear and overwhelming force. As a ruler, Nebuchadnezzar embodied the duality of Babylon itself, splendid in its achievements, yet terrifying in its ruthlessness. His reign left a legacy of both magnificence and destruction, an empire that built for eternity while simultaneously burying its enemies beneath its weight. In his pursuit of power, Nebuchadnezzar became a king who ruled through awe and terror, forever shaping the course of history with both his creations and his brutal conquests. The Babylonian military machine was an instrument of both expansion and terror. Under kings like Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon's armies marched with unstoppable force, conquering city after city across Mesopotamia and beyond. Their conquests weren't just about military superiority. They were about instilling terror, crushing entire populations, and leaving a trail of devastation that served as a warning to anyone who dared to defy Babylon's might. The scale of Babylonian warfare was staggering. Once a city or kingdom was defeated, the consequences were often brutal and final. Conquered peoples weren't simply defeated. They were massacred. Their cities burned to the ground, their resources pillaged, and their cultures erased. Whole populations were forced into enslavement or exiled to Babylon, forced to leave their homelands and live in foreign lands under Babylonian rule. Nebuchadnezzar's deportations, like the Babylonian captivity of the Jews, were designed to scatter people across the empire, breaking their spirits and preventing any chance of rebellion. They were not just exiled, They were made to forget their past, their identity, and their culture, stripped of everything that made them whole. Cities that resisted Babylonian power were often burned to ash. The streets were lined with the corpses of the slain, and the smoke from the burning ruins of once prosperous cities could be seen rising for miles. The very ground seemed scorched by the wrath of Babylon's military might. As the conquerors marched through the ruins, there was nothing left but the charred remains of homes, temples, and families, their once lively communities reduced to nothing more than ash and bone. For those who survived the initial onslaught, the horror only continued. Prisoners were impaled on massive stakes, displayed for all to see. These gruesome executions served not only as punishment, but as a public spectacle, a grotesque reminder of what happened to those who defied the king's will. The heads of the dead, often those of prominent figures, were placed on pikes or stacked in piles as a chilling display of power. These severed heads were meant to send a clear message: defiance meant death, and there would be no mercy. Fear was not just a side effect of Babylonian conquest. It was the primary weapon. The soldiers weren't just fighting wars, they were waging campaigns of terror. The people knew that resistance was futile, that any attempt at rebellion would only lead to their destruction. Babylon's reach stretched far, and its ability to create fear was unmatched. The very thought of crossing the empires might send shivers down the spine of every city, state under its rule. To live under Babylon was to live with the constant reminder that death and suffering lay at the feet of any who dared challenge the king. Babylon's military not only expanded the empire, but instilled a chilling sense of absolute dominance. The fear of Babylon was not just in the sword, it was in the mind. And it was this fear that allowed the empire to survive and thrive, even as the blood of the conquered stained its soil. The city of Babylon itself stood as a testament to the kingdom's power, but the horror and destruction wrought by its armies were what truly made it unforgettable. The true cost of Babylonian conquest wasn't measured just in territory or wealth. It was measured in the broken bodies and shattered lives of those who dared to stand against it. In Babylon, religion was not just a spiritual practice. It was a tool of power, fear, and control. Priests played a crucial role in this system, acting as intermediaries between the gods and the people. Their duties were not just ceremonial. They were essential to the survival of the kingdom. Animal sacrifices were performed regularly to appease the gods. Offerings meant to ensure the king's power and the prosperity of Babylon. The blood of the animals, spilled upon the sacred altars, symbolized the life force, given to the gods in exchange for protection and favor. The slaughter itself was often violent and grisly, a public spectacle to demonstrate the king's devotion to the gods, and to remind the people of the constant presence of divine authority. But the religious life of Babylon went far beyond sacrifices. The priests were also astrologers and diviners, gazing into the night sky, studying the movements of the stars and planets to predict the gods' intentions. Omens, from the flight of birds to the appearance of unusual phenomena, were interpreted as signs of divine will. A strange eclipse, the birth of a deformed animal, or a bad harvest could all be seen as warnings of impending doom. The belief in the power of omens created an atmosphere of constant unease, where every event, no matter how trivial, could be viewed as a sign of favor or anger from the gods. The people of Babylon were constantly on edge, watching for the slightest change in the heavens or in nature that might indicate their fate. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Babylonian religion was its dark, pervasive fear of the afterlife. Death was not just the end of life, it was a passage into a shadowy and feared realm, a place where the souls of the damned would face eternal suffering. The gods were vengeful, and the afterlife was a place where one's sins could be punished endlessly. This fear of the afterlife reinforced the Babylonian belief in strict obedience to the king and the divine order. To defy the king was to defy the gods, and those who rebelled could not escape the judgment of the gods in this life or the next. The kings of Babylon were deeply intertwined with this religious system. They didn't just rule by political might. They ruled as divine agents, gods in their own right. Their power came not only from their military strength, but from the belief that their reign was sanctioned by the heavens. The king's authority was seen as a direct reflection of divine favor. This was especially true of Nebuchadnezzar II, who, after a period of madness believed to be a punishment from the gods, famously claim have been humbled by divine intervention. His recovery was seen as proof of the gods' approval and further solidified his rule. In this system, religion became a means of controlling the masses. Fear of divine punishment kept the people obedient, while fear of death and the afterlife ensured that they remained compliant. The king, as both ruler and divine intermediary, could manipulate both the people's spiritual beliefs and their earthly existence, ensuring that his reign was unquestioned. The people were reminded daily that their fate, both in life and in death, was bound to the whims of the gods, and that to cross the king was to risk the wrath of divine forces far beyond mortal understanding. In Babylon, the line between religion and power was blurred beyond recognition. Kings wielded not only swords and armies, but also the very fabric of belief itself. The fear of gods, curses, and omens kept the kingdom in a constant state of tension, where the future was uncertain, and death could strike without warning. Babylonian rulers didn't just control their subjects, they controlled their souls, keeping them in perpetual fear of divine wrath, ensuring their obedience through the chilling reminder that their fate was in the hands of the gods, and the gods demanded compliance. As Babylon's wealth, power, and grandeur grew, so too did its cruelty and decadence. The very qualities that had once made the city a beacon of civilization also sowed the seeds of its downfall. The kings, intoxicated by their divine status, began to believe they were invincible, immortal in the eyes of the gods. They so skillfully manipulated. But beneath their opulent palaces and monumental walls, the empire had grown rotten. Its rulers had become tyrants, ruling not with wisdom, but with an iron fist of terror and indulgence. As the king's cruelty intensified, so did their detachment from the real world. The empire had become a gilded cage, where excess and luxury reigned supreme. But the heart of Babylon was no longer beating with the energy of its once proud people. The oppressive laws, the constant fear of rebellion, and the cruel treatment of conquered peoples alienated the very subjects they had once ruled with such dominance. Babylon's decadence had created a fragile empire, one that had failed to notice the rising storm outside its walls. In that moment, as the king and his courtiers stared in disbelief, the fate of Babylon was sealed. That very night, as Cyrus the Great of Persia moved his forces against the gates of Babylon, the city fell without a prolonged siege. The mighty walls that had once been thought impenetrable were breached, not through brute force, but by clever strategy. Cyrus's soldiers diverted the Euphrates River, allowing them to enter the city through its now exposed riverbed. The city fell in a night, and Belshazzar, the self-proclaimed ruler of the world, was slain. The irony of Babylon's fall was bitter and profound. The kings who had ruled with unquestioned fear, their cruelty and tyranny reinforced by divine imagery, ended in terror themselves. Babylon had been so accustomed to imposing its will through violence and intimidation that it never saw the rising power of Persia, nor the handwriting on the wall, both literal and metaphorical. The very fear they used to dominate others became their undoing. Babylon's rulers, once gods in the eyes of their people, were now powerless before an invading army. The city's grandeur and religious might had been no match for the strength and cunning of Cyrus. The kingdom that had once crushed its enemies beneath the weight of its military and divine authority, was now reduced to dust. Its rulers fallen, and its wealth claimed by others. The king who demanded to be feared was now just another casualty in the world of men. His end as swift and brutal as those of the countless victims who had once suffered under his rule. Babylon's collapse wasn't just a military defeat. It was a tragic reminder that no kingdom, no matter how great or how cruel, is immune to the forces of history. The very tyranny that had kept Babylon powerful eventually became the force that destroyed it. The Babylonians built a kingdom of stone, but it was fear that held it together. Their kings ruled like gods, their laws carved in flesh and blood. Babylon's grandeur and wealth were overshadowed by the brutal means used to maintain its power. Though the city fell to Persia's might, the lesson remains: civilizations rise in brilliance, but often they are bound together not by love, but by terror. History is dark, and we must remember it.